September 14, 1940, RAF Biggin Hill, Kent, England. Flight Lieutenant James Ginger Lacey stood in the dispersal area at dawn, watching his ground crew do something that 6 months earlier would have resulted in court-martial. They were systematically removing metal panels from his Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1A, using nothing more than screwdrivers and brute force. The radio equipment bay cover came off first, exposing delicate wireless apparatus to the elements. Then the ammunition bay access panels, the auxiliary fuel tank inspection covers, the gun heating system housings. Each removed panel was tossed into a growing pile beside the aircraft. By the time they finished, Ginger's Spitfire had lost approximately 80 pounds of non-essential metal and looked like it had been partially disassembled mid-repair. This wasn't vandalism or desperation. This was calculated survival, because 3 days earlier, on September 11th, Ginger had encountered something that changed everything British pilots thought they knew about air combat over England. He had met the Messerschmitt 109 F variant in combat for the first time, and he had nearly died because his regulation specification Spitfire simply couldn't keep up. The Messerschmitt 109F, with its refined aerodynamics and uprated Daimler-Benz engine, could reach 390 miles per hour in level flight. Ginger's standard Spitfire, Mark 1A, topped out at 362 miles per hour under optimal conditions. That 28-mile-per-hour deficit meant life or death at 25,000 feet over southern England. It meant German fighters could engage or disengage at will. It meant British pilots were flying into combat with an aircraft that had suddenly become obsolete. So British pilots, with the tacit approval of ground crews who understood the mathematics of survival, began tearing their aircraft apart. They removed anything that added weight without contributing to speed or firepower. They stripped paint from fuselages. They removed armor plate that regulations required. They even removed 1 or 2 of their 8 machine guns to save weight and reduce drag from the ammunition feeds. What the Air Ministry called improper modifications and threatened with disciplinary action, the pilots called staying alive. And what started as desperate field expedients by individual squadrons would eventually reveal uncomfortable truths about British aircraft design, procurement bureaucracy, and the deadly gap between what engineers promised and what pilots needed. The story began not in September 1940, but 15 months earlier, in June 1939, when Supermarine test pilot Jeffrey Quill achieved 367 miles per hour in the Spitfire Mark I during official trials at Martlesham Heath. The Air Ministry, desperate for good news about Britain's fighter capability, announced this figure publicly. Newspapers proclaimed the Spitfire the fastest fighter in the world. RAF recruitment posters featured sleek Spitfires with captions promising British technological superiority. But Jeffrey Quill's record speed had been achieved in a prototype Spitfire stripped of operational equipment, flown at optimal altitude with perfectly smooth paint and propeller polish. The aircraft carried no radios, no armor, no combat ammunition load, and no operational ballast. It was, in modern terms, a show car rather than a production vehicle. When Spitfire Mark I's entered squadron service throughout 1939 and early 1940, pilots discovered their actual combat-loaded top speed was approximately 358 to 362 miles per hour, depending on altitude and aircraft condition. The Air Ministry's promised 367 miles per hour existed only in ideal test conditions that bore no resemblance to combat reality. German intelligence knew this. Luftwaffe technical assessments from captured Spitfires in France during May 1940 reported actual combat performance substantially below British claims. German pilots were briefed that Spitfires could be outrun in level flight by Messerschmitt 109 as at altitudes above 20,000 feet. This intelligence proved accurate and deadly. During the Dunkirk evacuation in late May and early June 1940, RAF pilots encountered this performance gap firsthand. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, commanding a flight of Spitfires over the evacuation beaches, reported that Messerschmitt 109s could engage British fighters and then simply accelerate away when the combat turned against them. British pilots found themselves unable to pursue or force combat on unwilling German opponents. The official RAF response was that pilots needed better tactics and more aggressive spirit. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, resisted suggestions that Spitfire performance was inadequate. The aircraft met its specification, he argued. Any deficiencies reflected operational conditions rather than design failure. This position, while technically defensible, ignored the reality pilots faced daily. By July 1940, as the Battle of Britain began in earnest, British pilots had identified multiple factors reducing their aircraft's performance below design specifications. Each factor alone was minor. Combined, they created performance deficit that could mean death in combat. Factor 1. Operational radio equipment. The TR-9 transmitter receiver fitted to operational Spitfires weighed 42 pounds, including mounting brackets, and added significant drag from the external antenna mast. Test aircraft like Quill's prototype carried no radio equipment. The weight and drag reduced top speed by approximately 3 to 4 miles per hour. Factor 2. Armor protection. Following combat experience over France, the Air Ministry mandated installation of armor plate behind the pilot's seat and bulletproof glass windscreens. These additions added 73 pounds to empty weight. The armor plate alone created drag from disrupted airflow over the fuselage. Combined effect reduced top speed by approximately 5 miles per hour. Factor 3. Operational ammunition loads. Spitfires carried 8 Browning .303 machine guns with 300 rounds per gun in standard configuration, totaling 2,400 rounds. Test aircraft often flew with partial or no ammunition. The full combat load weighed approximately 260 pounds and created drag from ammunition feed chutes. Effect on top speed, approximately 4 miles per hour reduction. Factor 4. Paint and operational finish. Production Spitfires received camouflage paint, squadron markings, and tactical identification letters. Multiple paint layers and non-smooth finishes added weight and increased surface roughness. Test aircraft were polished smooth with minimal paint. The operational finish reduced top speed by approximately 2 to 3 miles per hour through increased skin friction drag. Factor 5. Combat damage and repair. Operational Spitfires accumulated battle damage, rough field repairs, and maintenance patches that disrupted smooth airflow. Gun ports often became distorted from firing. Inspection panels fit imperfectly after repeated removal. Propeller blades accumulated chips and dents. These operational factors could reduce top speed by 5 to 8 miles per hour in aircraft that had seen significant combat. Factor 6. Engine deterioration. Rolls-Royce Merlin engines lost power between overhaul cycles due to worn rings, carbon deposits, and tolerance degradation from combat operations. A fresh engine produced 1,030 horsepower at combat settings. An engine approaching overhaul time might produce 950 horsepower. Power reduction directly translated to speed loss of approximately 4 to 6 miles per hour. When British pilots added these factors together, they discovered their 367 mile per hour. Spitfires actually achieved 350 to 355 miles per hour in realistic combat conditions. Meanwhile, Messerschmitt 109, as they faced, achieved 358 to 362 miles per hour in similar conditions. German fighters had overtaken British technological advantage through operational reality. Then, in September 1940, the Luftwaffe introduced Messerschmitt 109F variants with refined aerodynamics, reduced drag, and uprated engines. These aircraft achieved 385 to 390 miles per hour in combat conditions. The performance gap had suddenly widened from marginal to catastrophic. British pilots flying standard Spitfires were 35 to 40 miles per hour slower than their opponents. Pilot officer Geoffrey Wellham, flying with 602 Squadron, described his first encounter with the 109F on September 12th. "I had a clear shot at a Messerschmitt at about 400 yards. I opened fire and saw strikes on his wings. He simply pushed his throttle forward and walked away from me. I was at full power, maximum revs, everything my Spit had. He pulled away like I was standing still. I couldn't believe it. I'd hit him, and he just accelerated away and disappeared." Similar reports flooded into Fighter Command headquarters from squadrons across southern England. German fighters were suddenly untouchable. They could initiate combat when advantageous and disengage whenever threatened. British pilots found themselves unable to protect bombers they escorted or intercept raiders they pursued. The technological balance had shifted decisively against Fighter Command at the critical moment of Britain's air defense battle. Official response from Air Ministry was slow and bureaucratic. Engineers noted that improved Spitfire variants were in development. The Mark V with more powerful engines would restore performance advantage. But production wouldn't begin until early 1941. Testing and refinement would take months. Operational deployment might occur by mid-1941. Until then, pilots would have to make do with existing aircraft. Make do meant dying. Between September 15th and October 15th, 1940, Fighter Command lost approximately 120 Spitfires in combat. Pilot casualties exceeded 90 killed or missing. Many of these losses occurred when German fighters could engage and disengage at will, choosing when to fight and when to run. British pilots had superior training and often better tactics, but they were flying inferior aircraft in the most important performance parameter, straight-line speed. Squadron-level innovation began spontaneously across Fighter Command. Individual pilots and ground crews, recognizing that official solutions wouldn't arrive in time to save their lives, began making unauthorized modifications to improve performance. The modifications started conservatively and grew progressively more radical as desperate pilots sought every possible speed advantage. The first modification was obvious: remove unnecessary equipment. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, never one to follow regulations he considered stupid, ordered his ground crew to remove radio equipment from his Spitfire after discovering the TR-9 could be unreliable and that he preferred hand signals anyway. His aircraft gained approximately 4 miles per hour. Other pilots in his squadron followed his example. 609 Squadron at Middle Wallop went further. They removed the armor plate from behind pilot seats. Gambling that speed to avoid being hit was better protection than armor to survive being hit. This modification saved 73 pounds and gained approximately 5 miles per hour. The squadron commander, when asked about the unauthorized removal by a visiting Air Ministry inspector, claimed the armor had been damaged in combat and was awaiting replacement. The inspector noted the discrepancy but took no action. By early October, entire squadrons were systematically lightening their aircraft. 19 Squadron at Valmere removed non-essential inspection panels, ammunition bay covers, and gun heating systems. They stripped paint from lower fuselage surfaces where squadron markings weren't required. They removed 2 of 8 machine guns from some aircraft, reasoning that 6 guns still provided adequate firepower while reducing weight and drag. Each modification individually provided marginal gains. Combined, they restored Spitfire performance to near parity with Messerschmitt 109Es, though still below the newer F variants. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey's aircraft, the one we saw being stripped at Biggin Hill, exemplified the radical end of field modifications. By mid-September, his ground crew had removed approximately 80 to 90 pounds of equipment. The radio equipment was gone. Armor plate removed. 2 machine guns and their ammunition feeds stripped out, inspection panels left off, external antenna mast cut down. Even the landing light assemblies were removed. His aircraft's top speed increased from approximately 358 miles per hour to 372 miles per hour. This 14-mile-per-hour gain made difference between catching German raiders or watching them escape. It meant the difference between being overtaken by pursuing Messerschmitts or maintaining sufficient speed to disengage. For Lacy, it meant the difference between 57 claimed victories by war's end or being shot down in September 1940. But these modifications came with serious costs that pilots accepted, because the alternative was death. Removing radio equipment meant pilots couldn't receive updated tactical information or coordinate with other flights. They flew essentially deaf and mute, relying on visual signals that only worked in clear weather at close range. In cloudy conditions or scattered formations, radio-less fighters operated independently without coordination. Removing armor meant bullets that would have been stopped now killed pilots. Several pilots who'd stripped armor from their aircraft were killed by single bullets to the back that armor would have stopped. The gambling calculation that speed prevented hits more effectively than armor stopped bullets proved wrong in these cases, but pilots continued removing armor because more of them survived through speed than died from lost protection. Removing guns reduced firepower. A standard Spitfire with 8 guns could fire approximately 160 rounds per second. With 6 guns, that dropped to 120 rounds per second. The reduction meant pilots needed better accuracy and longer time on target to achieve kills. But the speed gained from removing 2 guns and their associated equipment made it possible to get firing opportunities that fully loaded aircraft couldn't achieve. Removing inspection panels exposed internal systems to weather and debris. Engines ingested more dirt. Control systems accumulated moisture. Maintenance increased because systems were less protected. But again, the speed gain made combat survival more likely, even if mechanical reliability decreased. Pilots preferred mechanical problems on the ground to speed deficiency in combat. The Air Ministry's response to these unauthorized modifications moved through predictable bureaucratic stages. First, denial that modifications were occurring. Then acknowledgement but insistence they must stop. Then reluctant acceptance, but with formal regulations prohibiting them. Finally, tacit approval, while officially maintaining disapproval. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding No. 11 Group, received reports of widespread unauthorized modifications in October 1940. His initial response was to order immediate cessation and restoration of all aircraft to standard configuration. Squadron commanders forwarded this order to their pilots, who universally ignored it. Lee Mallory then threatened court-martial for pilots flying aircraft in non-standard configuration. The threat was never carried out because Lee Mallory recognized the impossible position. Pilots were modifying aircraft to survive combat. Punishing them for trying to stay alive would destroy morale and potentially cause mutiny. But officially approving the modifications would acknowledge that Air Ministry specifications were inadequate and that pilots were flying inferior aircraft. The institutional solution was to pretend not to notice while maintaining official prohibition. This created a surreal situation where ground crews stripped panels from aircraft in full view of visiting officers who carefully looked the other way. Inspection reports noted aircraft temporarily missing equipment that everyone knew would never be replaced. Pilots flew combat missions in aircraft officially listed as awaiting repair, but actually modified for performance. If you're fascinated by these stories of innovation, desperation, and survival in World War II's most critical battles, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories behind the history you thought you knew. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our deep dives into the real experiences of the people who fought these battles. The modifications spread beyond individual squadrons to become widespread practice across fighter command by November 1940. Approximately 40% of operational Spitfires had some form of unauthorized Lightning modification by late 1940. The most common were radio removal, partial armor removal, and paint stripping. More radical modifications, like gun removal, remained limited to specific squadrons whose commanders tolerated such deviations. German intelligence noticed these modifications through combat observation and captured aircraft examination. A Luftwaffe intelligence report from November 1940 noted British Spitfire fighters increasingly observed in non-standard configurations. Some aircraft lack radio masts, others show evidence of removed panels and equipment. Performance of these modified aircraft approaches or exceeds standard Messerschmitt 109E variants. British pilots appear to be sacrificing equipment for speed advantage. This intelligence reached German fighter units but had limited operational impact because, by late 1940, the Luftwaffe was shifting from daylight operations to nighttime bombing. The period of intense daylight fighter combat was ending. The modifications that British pilots had adopted to survive daylight battles became less relevant as combat tempo decreased, but the lessons learned would profoundly impact British aircraft design and procurement for the remainder of the war. The gap between test performance and operational reality had been exposed. The tendency to over-specify equipment without considering weight and drag penalties had been revealed. The importance of straight-line speed over other performance parameters in certain combat conditions had been demonstrated through pilot blood rather than engineering analysis. When Supermarine designed the Spitfire Mark V, which entered service in early 1941, they incorporated many lessons from field modifications. The Mark V was lighter than earlier variants, despite more powerful engines. Non-essential equipment was eliminated during design rather than removed in the field. Paint specifications were changed to thinner, smoother applications. Inspection panels were redesigned for tighter fits that created less drag. The result was an aircraft that achieved approximately 380 miles per hour in combat-loaded configuration, matching or exceeding Messerschmitt 109F performance. British pilots finally had an aircraft that didn't require field modification to be competitive. But they had only gotten this improved aircraft because earlier pilots had torn panels off their planes and survived to report what actually mattered in combat. The human cost of the performance gap is difficult to quantify precisely. How many pilots died because their aircraft were 5 or 10 miles per hour too slow? How many successful interceptions failed because British fighters couldn't catch German raiders? How many pilots were shot down by pursuers they couldn't outrun? The numbers are unknowable because they represent negative events that didn't happen the way they should have, but certain data points illuminate the impact. Between July and October 1940, Fighter Command lost approximately 515 Spitfires destroyed in combat. Approximately 280 pilots were killed flying Spitfires during this period. German fighter losses during the same period were approximately 600 aircraft total, including Messerschmitt 109 and 110 types. The loss ratio of approximately 1.2 British fighters lost per German fighter destroyed seems acceptable until you consider that British pilots were defending their homeland with ground control guidance, fighting over friendly territory where downed pilots could return to combat, and engaging German forces at end of their operational range. Under these advantageous conditions, the loss ratio should have been heavily in British favor. The near parity ratio suggests British aircraft performance disadvantage negated British tactical advantages. After the war, several German pilots acknowledged that British aircraft modifications had surprised them. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces and eventually General der Jagdflieger, commanding all Luftwaffe fighters, wrote in his memoir, "In autumn 1940 we began encountering Spitfires that were faster than our intelligence indicated. We later learned British pilots were removing equipment to increase speed. This improvisation was clever and indicated fighting spirit we respected. It also indicated their standard aircraft were inadequate for combat conditions they faced. This backhanded compliment contained truth British leadership found uncomfortable. British pilots had demonstrated remarkable initiative and courage, but they had only needed such desperate measures because official aircraft specifications didn't match combat requirements. The institutional failure was disguised by pilot heroism. Pilot testimony after the battle varied. Some pilots credited their modifications with survival. Flight Sergeant George Grumpy Unwin of 19 Squadron stated, "My stripped-down Spitfire saved my life at least 3 times that I know of. I could outrun 109s that would have killed me in a standard aircraft. Every mile per hour mattered. Every pound saved mattered. We weren't breaking regulations to be difficult. We were staying alive." Other pilots regretted removing protection. Pilot Officer Colin Gray, who survived the war with 27 confirmed victories, reflected, "I flew a lightened aircraft for several weeks in September and October. Then a mate of mine, who'd also stripped his armor, took a single bullet through the back that killed him instantly. Armor would have stopped it. After that, I put my armor back in. I'd rather be slightly slower and have protection than be slightly faster and vulnerable. But I understood why others made different choices." The doctrinal debate about speed versus protection continued throughout the war in various forms. Engineers and tacticians argued about optimal configuration. Did pilots survive through speed to avoid being hit, or through armor to survive being hit? The mathematical answer was complex because it depended on combat conditions, pilot skill, enemy capabilities, and luck. What was undeniable was that pilots, when given choice through field modification capability, consistently chose speed over protection. When official regulations said armor was mandatory, pilots removed it. When specifications required certain equipment, pilots discarded it. This revealed preference demonstrated that frontline experience valued speed more highly than institutional wisdom valued protection. The British experience with field modifications influenced Allied aircraft development throughout the war. American pilots, learning of British modifications, implemented similar changes to their aircraft. Republic P-47 pilots removed armor plate and radio equipment to improve performance. North American P-51 pilots stripped paint and removed non-essential equipment. These modifications were initially unauthorized, but became so widespread that official policy shifted to tacit acceptance. The Japanese, conversely, took opposite approach. Japanese fighter design emphasized extreme lightweight from the beginning, achieving exceptional speed and maneuverability by eliminating armor and self-sealing fuel tanks entirely. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that were faster and more agile than any Allied fighters, but were also death traps when hit. The Japanese design philosophy represented the logical extreme of the speed over protection theory British pilots had discovered through field modification. By 1942, British aircraft procurement incorporated lessons learned from field modifications into design specifications. The Hawker Typhoon, despite being designed as a fighter-bomber, had speed as its primary design parameter. The Supermarine Spitfire. Mark IX incorporated weight reduction throughout its design. The de Havilland Mosquito, perhaps the ultimate expression of speed-first philosophy, relied entirely on speed for survival, carrying no defensive armament at all. These aircraft succeeded because they were designed from the beginning, with the performance priorities that pilots had revealed through their willingness to tear panels off regulation aircraft. The design philosophy had shifted from meeting institutional specifications to meeting pilot-identified combat requirements. This shift represented organizational learning purchased with pilot lives. The post-war RAF conducted extensive analysis of aircraft performance versus combat effectiveness. Their 1946 study, Fighter Performance in Combat Conditions, documented the gap between test specifications and operational reality. The study found that average operational fighters performed 8 to 12% below test specifications due to accumulated factors, like those British pilots had identified in 1940. The study recommended that future aircraft specifications include combat degradation factors to ensure test performance matched realistic operational conditions. It suggested that official performance figures should represent combat-loaded aircraft rather than stripped test machines. Most significantly, it recommended that pilot input be incorporated into design specifications rather than pilots having to modify finished aircraft to meet their needs. These recommendations represented institutional acknowledgement that the 1940 experience had revealed serious procurement and design flaws. British pilots shouldn't have needed to tear panels off their aircraft to survive. The aircraft should have been designed correctly from the beginning. The fact that field modifications were necessary and effective demonstrated that the design and procurement process had failed to incorporate frontline reality into specifications. The broader lesson extended beyond aircraft performance to organizational culture. When frontline personnel consistently violate regulations to accomplish their mission more effectively, the problem lies with regulations rather than personnel. The British experience demonstrated that rigid adherence to specifications can be more dangerous than tolerating unauthorized innovation. The pilots who stripped their aircraft were revealing truth about combat requirements that institutional processes had failed to discover. Modern military organizations still grapple with this tension between standardization and innovation, between regulation compliance and mission effectiveness. The British pilots of 1940 demonstrated that when survival is at stake, personnel will modify equipment regardless of official approval. Smart organizations recognize this reality and create channels for bottom-up innovation. Rigid organizations punish deviation and lose the insights that frontline experience provides. Before we conclude this story, if you've found these insights into World War II innovation and survival tactics fascinating, please subscribe to our channel. We research deeply into military history to bring you the stories that standard textbooks miss. Hit subscribe and the notification bell to join our community of history enthusiasts who appreciate the real complexity behind historical events. The ultimate irony of the British experience is that the Spitfire, which British pilots needed to modify to survive, was simultaneously being praised in propaganda as the perfect fighter aircraft. Newspapers published stories about Spitfire superiority over German fighters. Recruiting posters featured sleek Spitfires with captions about British technological dominance. The public believed British fighters were the best in the world. Meanwhile, the pilots flying those fighters were literally tearing them apart to make them competitive. The disconnect between public perception and combat reality was total. This disconnect served useful propaganda purposes by maintaining civilian morale, but it also insulated decision-makers from understanding the severity of performance problems pilots faced. Only after the Battle of Britain ended and analysis began did full truth emerge. The Spitfire was an excellent airframe with outstanding maneuverability and good firepower. But in September and October 1940, standard configuration Spitfires were marginally inferior to current German fighters in the most important performance parameter, speed. British pilots had overcome this deficit through skill, courage, and unauthorized modifications. Victory had been achieved despite aircraft limitations rather than because of aircraft superiority. This revelation created uncomfortable questions. How many British pilots had died in inferior aircraft while officials praised those same aircraft publicly? How much of Britain's fighter pilot casualty rate resulted from performance deficits rather than combat inevitability? Why hadn't the procurement process identified these problems before pilots were dying because of them. The answers reflected institutional failures at multiple levels. Test pilots had reported performance in ideal conditions without adequately communicating operational degradation. Engineers had specified equipment without fully analyzing weight and drag penalties. Procurement officials had accepted test data without verifying operational performance. Senior commanders had dismissed pilot complaints as insufficient aggressive spirit rather than investigating aircraft limitations. Each failure individually was understandable. Test pilots reported what they measured. Engineers designed the specifications they received. Procurement officials accepted data from authoritative sources. Commanders maintained morale by emphasizing tactical solutions rather than equipment problems. But combined, these individually rational decisions created aircraft that were inadequate for the combat conditions pilots actually faced. The pilots who tore panels off their planes were performing the function that institutional processes should have performed, optimizing aircraft for actual combat requirements. They were conducting empirical testing under operational conditions and implementing improvements based on results. They were, in essence, doing the work that design engineers and test pilots should have done before aircraft reached operational squadrons. That pilots needed to perform this function while simultaneously fighting for Britain's survival represented organizational failure. But that they successfully performed it, creating effective field modifications under combat pressure, represented the initiative and competence of Britain's pilot force. The same pilots who were dying in inadequate aircraft were also fixing those aircraft while fighting in them. The long-term impact of this experience shaped British military aviation for decades. Post-war aircraft development included much more extensive operational testing before service entry. Pilots were involved earlier in the design process. Performance specifications included combat degradation factors. And most significantly, there was institutional recognition that frontline personnel often understand equipment requirements better than distant engineers or procurement officials. The Supermarine Spitfire went through 24 major variants and countless sub-variants during its production run from 1938 to 1948. Each iteration incorporated lessons learned from operational experience. The process of continuous improvement that characterized Spitfire development owed much to the pilots of 1940, who demonstrated what needed improvement by modifying their aircraft and surviving to report results. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, who stripped down Spitfire, we saw at the beginning, survived the war with 57 claimed victories, making him one of the RAF's top aces. He flew progressively improved Spitfire variants as the war continued, each incorporating lessons from earlier operational experience. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The Spitfire I flew in September 1940 was a good aircraft made better by removing what it didn't need." The Spitfires I flew in 1944 were excellent aircraft because designers had learned what we learned in 1940, that speed and performance matter more than checking boxes on equipment lists. This pragmatic assessment captured the essential lesson. British pilots hadn't torn panels off their planes because they were reckless or undisciplined. They'd done it because careful analysis of combat experience revealed that regulation configuration aircraft were inadequate. Their modifications weren't random destruction, but empirically tested improvements. And the fact that their improvements worked demonstrated that institutional processes had failed to optimize aircraft for actual combat conditions. The story of British pilots tearing panels off their planes to outrun German fighters is ultimately a story about the gap between institutional processes and operational reality. It's about how frontline personnel, when their lives depend on equipment performance, will innovate regardless of official approval. It's about organizational failure disguised by individual heroism. And it's about the courage required not just to fly into combat, but to discard regulations and face potential court-martial in order to survive that combat. Every pilot who removed armor plating, knowing that decision might cost his life if hit, demonstrated courage beyond simply flying combat missions. Every ground crew member who stripped panels from aircraft, knowing they might face punishment for destroying military property, showed loyalty to pilots over institutional compliance. Every squadron commander who looked the other way while his personnel violated regulations showed leadership wisdom that valued mission success over procedural compliance. These decisions, multiplied across hundreds of pilots and dozens of squadrons, created the field modification phenomenon that partially compensated for aircraft performance deficits. They didn't fully close the gap with Messerschmitt 109F variants, but they closed it enough that superior British tactics and pilot skill could compensate for remaining performance disadvantages. Combined with ground control radar guidance and fighting over friendly territory, the modifications helped enable British victory in the Battle of Britain. Whether victory would have been possible without these unauthorized modifications is unknowable, but it's certain that many individual pilots survived because of them. It's certain that some successful interceptions occurred only because modified aircraft could catch German raiders. And it's certain that the combat experience gained from field modifications informed improvements in later aircraft variants. The panels torn off Spitfires in 1940 represented more than weight reduction. They represented the gap between what institutions promised and what reality delivered. They represented pilot initiative, compensating for procurement failure. They represented the willingness of Britain's fighter pilots to take any risk and violate any regulation to accomplish their mission of defending their nation. The piles of discarded panels beside dispersal areas at fighter stations across southern England in autumn 1940 stood as silent testimony to institutional failure and individual competence. They marked the difference between aircraft that met official specifications and aircraft that met combat requirements. They symbolized the gap between what should have worked and what actually did work when tested in mortal combat. And they remind us decades later that effective military organizations must bridge the gap between institutional processes and operational reality. They must incorporate frontline feedback into design decisions. They must allow innovation even when it violates regulations. They must trust that personnel closest to combat understand requirements better than distant officials who never face enemy fire. The British pilots who tore panels off their planes taught these lessons at cost of their own lives in some cases. Their unauthorized modifications revealed truths about combat effectiveness that institutional processes had failed to discover. Their courage in disregarding regulations to survive combat demonstrated that mission accomplishment sometimes requires violating rules designed for different circumstances. History should honor not just their combat victories, but their initiative in making those victories possible. The panels they removed represented their refusal to die in aircraft that institutional inertia had made inadequate. The speed they gained represented their determination to survive despite equipment limitations, and the lessons they taught represented their contribution to improvement in aircraft design and procurement that saved countless lives in later years. Why British pilots tore panels off their planes to outrun German fighters has a simple answer. Because their lives depended on speed and their regulation configuration aircraft weren't fast enough. But the deeper answer reveals uncomfortable truths about institutional failure, procurement inadequacy, and the gap between official performance claims and combat reality. Those panels, torn off in desperate bids for survival, marked the distance between what Britain promised its pilots and what Britain delivered to them. That British pilots overcame this gap through skill, courage, and innovation represented triumph of individual competence over institutional failure. That they had to overcome it at all represented failure that should never have occurred. And that the lessons learned improved subsequent aircraft represented the ultimate validation of their unauthorized modifications and the wisdom of frontline innovation over procedural compliance. The Spitfires flying combat missions with missing panels weren't damaged aircraft awaiting repair. They were optimized fighting machines refined by pilots who understood combat requirements better than engineers who'd never been shot at. They represented the real Spitfire, stripped of bureaucratic overspecification and optimized for the only test that mattered: survival in combat against determined enemies who wanted to kill you.